Today's series is how to paint mountains. So I've got my 4 landscape drawings already prepped and taped. First off, we want to mix up our first set of colors. You'll want to grab an extra paper to swatch your colors. For the sky, I had some leftover blue in my palette, which I used. It was just a mixture of phthalo blue and turquoise. So it was a touch on the green side, but use whatever blue you'd like. The colors for the mountain is a warm, dark, brownish black. So I mixed together brown and reds, and then I add a bit of purple, which darkens up and kind of desaturates it, meaning it loses its vibrancy. And then I add a touch of black. You should notice while it is dark, it has this warm undertone with brown showing through. Now you're going to want to pre-wet the paper, specifically the sky. This will help with the cloud technique I'm about to show you. Now, while you're painting the sky, pay attention to the reference photo. You don't want to paint the clouds exactly the way you see them, but try to mimic the shapes and the direction of the clouds. You can see that I leave the white of the cloud unpainted, and I just paint the blue of the sky. Pre-wetting the paper will ensure that the clouds are soft with no hard edges. The right hand of the sky is the darkest, so I make sure I add a bit more pigment to that side. I go in with a clean damp brush and define the clouds a bit more by lifting up more of that blue sky with my paintbrush. Moving on to the mountains, pull out your salt, whether you have coarse, ground, whatever you have on hand, and this will help create a bit of texture in the darkest areas of the mountains. Make sure your sky is completely dry before you begin. Use a hairdryer if you're impatient like me. Now, I already have marked out the dark areas of the mountain with the pencil, so I don't really have to think too much about where I'm putting the dark pigment. I do keep an eye on the reference photo as I work to make sure that I'm leaving little bits of white showing to represent the snow. You don't have to be super precise with this step. Just make sure you don't paint the entire sections dark. You want to keep that little bits of white showing through. It's really about training your eye to see pattern in the reference photo and trying to mimic those rough shapes. Now, my warm black wasn't dark enough, as you can see, so I do have to mix in more purple and a touch of black into my paint mixture. And once I've mapped out the general shapes of the dark areas, I go in with that darkened color while the paint is still wet. And you can leave those little bits of lighter brown showing through as well. Also, make sure to add the salt while the paint is still wet. There is a ridge right in the middle of the mountain, and I draw that in and add a few smaller details around the dark shapes on the left-hand side. And try squinting your eyes at the reference photo to help blur out the details. You don't want to get too caught up on every single little detail. You just want the general shapes, and squinting kind of helps blur out the smaller details and helps you focus on the main shapes and shadows. Moving on to the right hand side of the mountain, next I paint in the few details I see there. There are some rocky mountain poking through the snow on the right hand side, and I want to make sure that I'm blending those hard edges by cleaning my brush, dabbing off the extra water, and running it along the bottom edges especially. Then I go in while the paint is still wet and I drop a little of that dark color, not to the whole area, just enough to add some variation. And I make sure to add some salt at the end. Now, if you look at the reference photo, you may notice dark shadows on the left-hand side of the mountain. And there are areas of sunlit snow and darker shadows. And so we want to paint in those dark shadows next. We want to mix up a blue-gray for this section. So I start off with my phthalo blue, mix in some warm reds and purples. You want to make sure that the mountains are 100% dry. I use the hairdryer. And if the underpainting is still not dry, you may run the risk of smearing those dark edges of the Rocky Mountain. Now, this technique is called glazing, and I use the watered down pigment painting right over top of the previous layer. Now don't paint the entire left side blue. Make sure that you're paying attention to those sunlit areas and leave those unpainted. I also paint in a few really light shadows on the right hand side of the mountain too, making sure to blend those edges. Then I go in with a second layer for the shadows. There are a few spots where the shadows are a shade darker, and this part is optional. If you don't want to do it, then move on. I also go in and add some of the dark blue shadow color to the warm tone of the Rocky Mountain. This kind of helps darken up some of those areas as well. All right, the next little mini painting is this foggy mountain. Start by pre-wetting the sky with clean water. I use the previous blue and just mix in some more phthalo blue to make the sky color a little less green. And if you look at the reference photo, you may be able to tell that there's this little peachy pink at the horizon line. So I go ahead and mix that up using a really watered down red with a touch of yellow. It should be quite pale and subtle. For the sky, I block in the sky using the same technique as the first painting. And your sky should get light the closer you get to the horizon line, so you will want to blend the bottom line of that blue sky by washing your brush and dabbing off the extra water onto a paper towel and then running along that edge, blending downward. Then pick up that pink color and lay that at the base of the horizon as well. If you found that you've overdid it with the clouds, I take the paper towel and you can actually twist it to a point, and you can use that to lift some of the pigment off of the white clouds. Just cleaning up the edges and making sure the shapes are how I want them. While the paint is still wet, I'm going to go in with a second layer of the sky, dropping in more pigment to bring a touch of more color to the sky. I also blend the bottom of the horizon again to make sure that I don't have any hard edges. Let's move on to the Misty Mountain portion. Next, we're going to do the first layer is a watered down phthalo blue. If you look at the reference photo, the mountains furthest away are the lightest in color. And those are the mountains we want to paint first because we're going to paint light to dark, building up that contrast. In between each mountain layer, I dry the paint completely. Then I add a touch more blue to the mixture to darken it up and paint the second layer. For each mountain, I basically apply the pigment at the top of each mountain and then blend out the bottom. You want it a bit lighter at the base to mimic that foggy feeling. Third mountain is a bit bigger, so to make painting it and blending it out easier, I go ahead and pre-wet the mountain. And I keep adding more of the blue pigment to darken up the mixture. And I add a little bit of purple as well. Make sure that you dry your painting in between each layer. And I definitely got the first mountain too light the first time around, so I have to go in with the second layer because you can barely see it. Now, this is where I start to go wrong. So take this as lessons to learn. To darken the last mountain, I added black, which was way too strong of a jump in contrast. And I should have added just more blue and maybe a touch more purple. And it may not look that bad on video, but in person it was just too strong. Now, the second mistake I made was I actually glazed some watered down blue to boost up the contrast a little bit, like that blue color. And it was actually activating the layer below and kind of moving that pigment, which happens usually if you don't properly dry the layer below. So I decided to abandon ship at this point and I completely wet the surface and I took a paper towel and lifted up the paint. And I dried this whole painting completely with a hairdryer. And you know it's still damp if it's cool to the touch. But when things go wrong, do not panic. Oftentimes you can get away with lifting up the pigment a bit and trying again. So that's what I do. I try again, making sure to dry the layers in between. I paint my layered mountains again. You will make mistakes as you experiment and it's natural and it's okay. Don't be afraid of messing up. All right, my friends, stay tuned for part 2.